Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to speak to you this afternoon on this opening day of London International Shipping Week. It's an aptly named week, for London is at the heart of global business. Indeed, as a country, the UK has always been best when it looks outwards, when we're playing a leading role in the international community. So it may come as a surprise to many on the outside looking in that we could even contemplate leaving the European Union, a bloc which, at least on its surface, is fundamentally internationalist in its purpose. But we as a country are contemplating it. Some have argued that to leave the European Union will be a retreat from the global community. Others have argued that the EU no longer works as a supranational body, that it has itself become too narrowly focused, too inward-looking. My argument today, quite simply, is that the European Union is a great idea, but it's just gone wrong. That's not to say it can't be rescued and the UK's membership of it salvaged, but my goodness, is there a lot of work to do. I say the EU is a great idea because I believe in free trade. In the shipping industry, any mechanism that can promote free trade is a welcome one. But the political and governmental institutions that have been built around that concept are now the very things that prevent that common market from working effectively. The Commission, in my view, is too highly siloed. Therefore, it lacks firm, holistic, strategic direction. We sense some worthy social and environmental ideals, but how visible is a core economic plan to ensure European competitiveness in an increasingly tough world? There's a clear imbalance here, and some would even say that Europe appears, at best, lukewarm towards business. None of Europe's problems can be solved with a silo mentality, but currently the mechanisms for a balanced scorecard are weak, and some would say non-existent. So here, the European Commission fails. Environmental regulations can be pushed through without any consideration for their economic impact. Economic progress is all too often overlooked in pursuit of social and environmental ideals. But with too little economic progress, can these ideals be afforded? Taking an holistic, rounded view of regulations in proactive consultation with those it will affect most is not something the Commission does well. Now, the Sulphur Directive, one of my favourites, is a case in point. Reducing sulphur emissions from ships is something, of course, we agree with, and the industry has taken significant steps forward in that regard. But the gold plating of IMO Annex 6 has strangled the opportunity for an orderly transition which would smooth the economic impact on European shipping. If the team working on the directive had spoken to their colleagues who are experts in manufacturing, they would know the technology required to meet their regulations hadn't been properly developed yet. Indeed, if they'd spoken to their colleagues responsible for the Water Framework Directive, they would have understood the need to resolve wider regulatory contradictions which prevent our industry from doing what the Sulphur Directive intended it to do. And if they'd spoken to us a little bit more, then they would have realised that we weren't some big bad industry, but that we actually wanted to work with them to find a really good solution that solved the problem. We've ended up with an ambiguous directive so badly written that countless EU member states couldn't even agree on what it actually meant in practice. And if we have different interpretations of the same rules, then we have different operating practices, different standards, and essentially different rules across Europe. And that is exactly the opposite of what the single market was supposed to deliver. Now, that's not European Union, that's European disunion. Now, I work in the cruise sector. You know, it's a growing and it's a really exciting business that is delivering great economic opportunities for the UK and for Europe as a whole. But if the European Commission insists on making life unnecessarily difficult for business, then for us, in a global environment with movable assets, the business can and it will move elsewhere. Now, I said at the beginning of my remarks that the European Union was a good idea gone wrong. Now, you can see that elsewhere, well beyond shipping. But we should also recognise that sometimes it gets things right. Now, for example, the recent revisions to the Package Travel Directive, they were introduced to reflect modern working practices which, via the internet, allow consumers to transact across European borders. Now, this one, they handle it competently, fairly, and importantly, they allow tour operators, which includes cruise lines, to be bonded for consumer protection purposes, not just in a single member state, but that same bonding then became good in every member state. And that enabled us to trade cross-border very effectively without having to be bonded in every single member state. Really sensible, and it is proof that the Commission can work. So there are some examples of what the European Union does well and not so well. But in the national debate ahead, we've got to decide not just what it's capable of doing, but what the European Union should be doing. Now, in a global industry like ours, I don't believe we need a regional regulator. We need a global one. The United Nations International Maritime Organization sets the rules. It provides a global level playing field, for global businesses. When the European Union gets too heavily involved, it can distort that level playing field. And as a maritime nation, the UK all too easily bears the brunt of that. Europe should be congratulated for introducing state aid guidelines for shipping, which are manifested in member states' tonnage taxes as a mechanism for preserving its global shipping competitiveness. But all that good is actually under threat through environmental gold plating and social protectionism. So the European Union should abandon its attempts to increase its own regulatory power, but instead focus on one simple goal: making the single market work. And that should be the primary focus of the Prime Minister's negotiations, not least because it will deliver changes that the rest of Europe could support. Now, much has been said about these negotiations, that it'll be just window shopping. They'll be sticking plasters, or even just pointless. But that's because the Prime Minister risks, if he's not careful, tinkering with something that needs fundamental reform. He may well repatriate some powers, but the success there probably will only be short-lived. Now, the principle of ever closer union is so dominant in European thinking that it'll only be a matter of time before the UK is sucked back into the direction of travel that gives more powers away. Now, we all need to be more ambitious because we may never get another chance to reform how the union works. And the Prime Minister can show real leadership by arguing that the European Union should do less, but should do it better. So I hope he argues passionately and persuasively for a leaner, more focused and ultimately more united Commission that stops trying to claim further powers but sees itself as a competition watchdog capable of delivering this truly single market. We need a European red tape challenge that identifies and eliminates unnecessary and outdated regulation. And we need a one-in, one-out approach that will make the Commission stop and think as to whether new regulation really is necessary. So the European Union, it can be a force for good, and it can be our best chance to ensure that we participate in an economy big enough to compete with America, China, and the growing powers of India, Brazil, and beyond. But it has to help, not hinder us. The The Prime Minister's reforms cannot just win a better deal for the UK, but can deliver a better union as a whole. And that should be his aim. Because for too long, politicians have promised reform, but they've never even spelled out what reform looks like, let alone deliver it. Now, I'm going to leave you with one final, very long-term thought. It's just my own. Over the next 100 years, the combined populations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America will at least double. They could well treble. Europe's, by contrast, will stay static with an aging demographic. And as its share of the global population declines, its political and economic influence will be under increasing threat. And that's why the European Union cannot continue to constrain its global competitiveness. Because otherwise, in 50 years' time, Europe could be an economic also-ran devoid of influence. So the debate which the Prime Minister now leads can be the catalyst in galvanizing Europe for the future, avoiding stagnation, building global leadership, and ensuring that we are a thriving group of nations ready to compete across the world. Thank you.